The wagon had been sitting at an angle in the ditch since mid-afternoon. One wheel cracked clean through at the axle, and Mercy had been sitting beside it for nearly as long, working through her options the way a woman works through a very short list. She had $2 and some cents in her coat pocket. She had a trunk too heavy to carry far. She had a horse that had gone lame 3 miles back, and that she had walked the rest of the way out of duty and affection before tying it to a post outside the town of Harlan Cross and leaving it with the livery man who had looked at the leg and looked at her and shaken his head in a way that meant the horse was not going to be walking anywhere useful for some considerable time. She had hired the wagon and driver to take her and the trunk west to the next settlement, where she had been told there was a boarding house that took women alone, and the driver had gotten the wheel into the ditch before they were 4 miles out of town and had unhitched his own horse and ridden back to town for a replacement wheel, and told her he would be back before dark. That had been 4 hours ago. The sun was going now. The plains were going that deep copper color they go in the last 20 minutes of light, and the wind had picked up, and Mercy had made a decision. She picked up her trunk and began walking. She did not walk back toward town. She had nothing waiting for her in Harlan Cross. She walked west, which was the direction she had been going, which was the direction that contained the boarding house, and whatever was going to happen next. And after about half a mile she came to a gate with a lamp burning on the post, and a track running through it toward a ranch that sat low and solid on the flat ground ahead. She stood at the gate for a moment. Then she opened it and went through. The main house was dark at the front, but there was light coming from the barn, which stood off to the right of the house with its big double doors slightly open, and the warm smell of hay and horses breathing out through the gap. She heard a man's voice inside, low and steady, the way men talk to horses when they think no one is listening. She knocked on the barn door with her knuckles. The voice stopped. Then the door opened wider and a man stood in it with a lantern held up and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has not been surprised in a long time and is working out whether to be now. He was somewhere in his 40s, she thought, though the lantern light made it hard to be certain. Tall, dark-haired, going gray at the sides, a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and eyes that were dark and steady, and were looking at her with an attention that was not unkind but was not soft either. He wore a worn work shirt with the cuffs unbuttoned and the kind of hands that came from years of rope and fence and iron. He did not speak first. He waited. She said, "My wagon broke down on the road about half a mile east. The driver went for a wheel and did not come back. I need somewhere to shelter until morning." He looked at her, then past her at the darkness and the trunk she had set down at her feet. "There is a hotel in Harlan Cross," he said. "I know," she said. "I cannot afford it." Another silence. The lantern swayed slightly in the draft. "I am a widow," she said, because she had learned that this information changed things for some men, and she had become practical about deploying it. "I am not asking for charity. I will work for this space, whatever needs doing." He looked at the trunk again, then at her face. "The barn is warm," he said. "There is clean hay in the far stall. I will get you a blanket." He said it the way a man says a thing he has decided on and does not intend to discuss further. "Thank you," she said. "Gideon Crane," he said, and stepped back to let her in. "Mercy Aldous," she said, and picked up her trunk and went past him into the barn. It was warm inside the way barns are warm, which is a different warmth from a house, deeper and older, the warmth of large bodies and packed straw and years of breath. There were 6 stalls along the left side and 4 along the right, and most of them held horses in various stages of evening restlessness. At the far end, in the largest stall on the right, a horse stood alone and looked at her. It was the most beautiful animal she had ever seen, a gray stallion, almost white, with a neck that arched like something carved, and eyes that were dark and intelligent, and were fixed on her with an intensity that made her stop walking. "That is Calhoun," Gideon said from behind her. "He does not take to strangers." As if in response to this, Calhoun put his nose over the stall door and blew a long, slow breath in Mercy's direction. She looked at the horse. The horse looked at her. "He seems fine," she said. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. She could not quite read it. He brought her a blanket from the tack room and a tin cup of water from the rain barrel outside, and showed her the empty stall at the near end where the hay was clean and deep, and said if she needed anything, she should knock on the side door of the house, which was 20 feet from the barn, and he would hear it. Then he went back to whatever he had been doing when she arrived, which appeared to be checking the hooves of a roan mare in the second stall, and he did it without fuss or ceremony and without looking at her again, and she spread the blanket over the hay and sat on it and drank the water and listened to the barn settle around her, and thought that she was in a stranger's barn in the middle of the Kansas plain with everything she owned in a trunk and no plan past morning. This was not the lowest she had been. She held on to that. Her husband Aldous had died 11 months ago of a fever that had taken him in 4 days, which was long enough for her to understand what was happening and short enough that she had not fully believed it until it was done. He had left her a small house and a smaller amount in savings and a debt to his brother that she had not known about until the brother arrived 3 weeks after the funeral with a document and an expression that told her the document was real and the debt was large and the house was going to have to go toward it. She had not argued. She had never been good at arguing with men who had documents. She had packed what she could carry and gone to work for a family in Harlan Cross, who had needed a housekeeper, and she had worked for them for 8 months, until the wife's sister came from Ohio to help with a new baby, and the extra help was no longer required, and Mercy had found herself with her trunk and her savings, and the address of a boarding house. 2 settlements west scribbled on a piece of paper in her coat pocket. She was 34 years old, and she had a practical nature, and she did not spend much time on self-pity. But sitting in a stranger's barn in the dark with the horses breathing around her, she allowed herself one quiet moment of it before she folded it up and put it away and lay down on the hay and closed her eyes. She did not expect to sleep. She slept almost immediately. She woke to a sound she could not place at first, a rhythmic low sound almost like a song, and she lay still in the hay and listened until she understood that it was the stallion Calhoun moving in his stall at the far end of the barn, not in distress but with a restlessness that had a direction to it. He was moving toward her end of the barn and then toward her end again, and each time he reached the near wall of his stall, he made that low sound. She sat up. It was still dark outside. The lantern Gideon had left burning low at the center post cast just enough light to see by. She could see Calhoun's head over his stall door, his ears forward, his dark eyes on her. She stood and went to him. She was not sure why. She was not a horsewoman particularly. She had grown up in a town, had learned to ride out of necessity and nothing more. But there was something in the way the horse was looking at her that asked to be answered, and she had always been a woman who answered things that asked. She stopped a foot from the stall door and looked at him. He put his nose against her hand. His breath was warm and his nose was soft as worn velvet, and he leaned into her palm with a gentleness that seemed impossible for an animal his size, and she stood there in the low lamplight with her hand against his face, and felt, for reasons she could not have explained, less alone than she had felt in 11 months. She did not hear Gideon come in. She heard him stop. She turned and found him standing at the barn door in a coat thrown over his work shirt, clearly having dressed in a hurry, and he was looking at her and at the horse and at her hand against the horse's nose with an expression she had no name for. "He woke me," she said, feeling the need to explain. "He was restless." "He woke you," Gideon repeated. He said it as if he was checking whether he had heard correctly. The sound he was making. Gideon looked at the horse. The horse was standing with his head over the door and his nose still against Mercy's palm, and his eyes half closed and his entire enormous body in a state of complete relaxation. "He has not let anyone touch him in 2 years," Gideon said. Mercy looked at the horse, then back at Gideon. "He seemed to want to," she said. Another silence. The barn was very quiet. Outside, somewhere far off, a coyote called once and stopped. Gideon crossed the barn slowly and stood on the other side of Calhoun's stall door and looked at the horse. And then at Mercy. He was close enough now that she could see the lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples, and something in his face that was familiar to her, because she had seen it in her own mirror. The look of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that they have forgotten what it felt like to put it down. "He was my son's horse," Gideon said. She kept her hand still against the horse's nose. "My boy trained him from a foal. They had 4 years together before the fever took him." A pause. "That was 2 years ago. Calhoun has been unmanageable since. I kept him because I could not do otherwise." Mercy looked at the horse. The horse leaned further into her hand. "They grieve," she said quietly. "People forget that." Gideon looked at her. It was the second time a man had looked at her that way in a barn, and she had the strange feeling of a conversation happening underneath the one they were having, something being said between them that neither of them had words for yet. "You should sleep," he said. "I will not bother you again." "You did not bother me," she said. He nodded once and went back to the door and then stopped with his hand on the frame. "His name was Jacob," he said. He did not turn around when he said it. She understood that he had not said that name to anyone in a long time. "Jacob is a good name," she said. He went out. She stood with her hand on Calhoun's nose until the horse finally lowered his head and closed his eyes completely, and then she went back to her hay and her blanket and lay down and stared at the dark rafters above her and thought about the particular loneliness of a man who cannot even say his dead son's name, and she felt the shape of that grief, because she knew the shape of grief, and she did not sleep again for a long time. In the morning she was up before the light fully came. She folded the blanket and stacked it and went to the rain barrel and washed her hands and face and smoothed her hair back as best she could, and then she went to the side door of the house and knocked. Nothing for a moment. Then boots on floorboards and the door opened, and Gideon stood there in the same clothes as the night before with a cup of coffee already in his hand, and looked at her with the particular alertness of a man who had not slept much either. "I said I would work for this space," she said. "Let me make breakfast." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. The kitchen was large and plain and functional, and had the particular disorder of a room managed by a man alone. She found eggs and salt pork and flour and a cast-iron skillet that had not been seasoned properly in some time, and she set to work without asking where things were, finding them by the logic of kitchens. And Gideon sat at the table and drank his coffee and watched her in silence. The silence was not uncomfortable. That was the thing she noticed. She had spent a year in uncomfortable silences, in the silence of the house after Aldous died, in the silence of the family in Harlan Cross, who had not known what to say to her and had eventually stopped trying. This silence was different. It was the silence of two people who were not yet sure of each other, but were not afraid of the uncertainty. She put the food on the table and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him, and they ate. "Where were you headed?" he said. "A boarding house in Settlers Bend. I was told they take women alone." He ate for a moment. "Who told you that?" "The woman at the dry goods store in Harlan Cross." He nodded slowly. "Mrs. Henley's place. It is decent enough." A pause. "It is also 40 miles further west than most people understand when they are told 2 settlements over." Mercy set her fork down. She had not known that. She looked at her coffee and worked through the arithmetic of $2 and some cents and 40 miles, and a lame horse and a cracked wagon wheel, and arrived at an answer she did not like. I see, she said. I have a spare horse, he said. Sound legs, easy temperament. You can have the use of her for the journey. She looked up at him. That is too much, she said. I cannot repay that. You made breakfast, he said, as if this settled it, and went back to his eggs. She watched him for a moment. You live here alone? She said. Since my son died. I had a housekeeper for a time. She left to be closer to her family in the spring. And before your son. A pause. Longer than the others. My wife died when Jacob was 3. Fever. He said it the way people say things they have said many times to many people and have learned to say without expression, which is different from not feeling it. Jacob and I managed well enough. He was a good boy. She did not say she was sorry. She said, he must have been, to have that horse love him the way it does. Something moved in Gideon's face, something that had been held very flat and still. Yes, he said. He was. She stayed 3 days. She told herself it was practical. The wagon driver had in fact returned. She learned from Gideon, who had ridden into Harlan Cross that first morning on an errand. But the replacement wheel had not arrived on the expected stage, and would not arrive until Thursday, and the driver was not prepared to make the journey again until the wheel was fitted. There was no faster way west without a horse of her own, and no money to hire one. The loan of Gideon's spare horse was a generous offer, but she had learned to be careful about debts to men she did not know, and she told herself she was simply waiting on circumstances. She was also useful. That was the other thing. She was deeply, comprehensively useful in a way that she had not been permitted to be in the household in Harlan Cross, where her role had been specific and bounded and supervised. Here there was a kitchen that wanted organizing, and a larder that wanted proper stocking, and a fence along the south pasture that needed 2 people to restring the wire, and Gideon needed the second pair of hands, and she had them. She worked alongside him in the mornings and cooked in the evenings, and in between, she went to the barn and sat with Calhoun, who had by the second day taken to waiting at his stall door when he heard her coming. The ranch hands, 2 brothers named Foss and Pete, who came in from the bunkhouse at dawn and left after supper, watched all of this with the careful neutrality of men who understood something was happening and had decided it was not their business to have opinions about it. Gideon watched her differently. He watched her the way he watched his horses, she thought. With patience and attention and something underneath that was not yet ready to be anything but watching. She caught him at it sometimes, and he did not look away, which surprised her. Men who were caught looking usually looked away. He simply held her gaze for a moment and then went back to whatever he was doing, unhurried, as if he had decided the looking was not something he needed to apologize for. On the second evening, she was sitting on the porch steps after supper with a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, watching the last light go out of the sky, when he came and sat on the step beside her. Not close, but beside her, in the particular way that means a choice was made. They sat without talking for a long time. You are good with broken things, he said eventually. She looked at him. The fence, he said. And the ledger I could not make balance. And the horse. She understood that he was not only talking about the fence and the ledger and the horse. I have had practice, she said. So have I, he said. But I am better at building things than fixing them. My son used to say I had no patience for anything that needed gentling. She thought about that. Jacob was gentle, she said. He was. I do not know where he got it from. Perhaps from watching his father try, she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are easy to talk to. I am easy to talk to because I do not talk much, she said. People confuse the two. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one, and she thought it was probably not a sound he made very often, and she felt, unreasonably, pleased to have been the cause of it. On the morning of the third day, a woman arrived. She came in a trap driven by a hired man, and she was dressed well for a ranch visit, which was to say she was overdressed, and she had the kind of beauty that knows itself and is accustomed to the effect it has. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, with sharp eyes that took in the yard and the house, and Mercy standing at the fence with a bucket of feed and narrowed slightly. Her name was Lavinia Crane. She was Gideon's sister-in-law. His wife's younger sister, she explained, with an emphasis on the connection that told Mercy exactly what Lavinia thought the connection entitled her to. She sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and was polite to Mercy in the way a woman is polite to someone she is assessing, and she talked to Gideon about things in town and about a cousin's wedding coming in the fall, and about whether he had thought about coming to her family's place for the summer, which he clearly had not, and she watched Mercy move around the kitchen with those sharp eyes and said nothing directly about it for a long time. Then she said, "Gideon, where did you say this woman came from?" Gideon, who was at the table with his coffee, said, "Harlan Cross. Her wagon broke down. And she has been here 3 days." "She has." Lavinia smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind with nothing behind it. "I only ask," she said, "because people in town will talk. You know how they are. A widow alone with a man, no chaperone. It reflects on you as much as on her." Mercy kept her hands steady on the bread she was shaping. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Then they will talk," he said. "It has not stopped me doing anything yet." Lavinia's smile did not change, but something behind her eyes did. She left an hour later. At the gate she paused and looked back at the house, and Mercy, who had come to the porch, met her eyes across the yard, and neither of them looked away until Lavinia climbed into the trap, and the hired man clicked the horse forward, and they went down the road in a small cloud of dust. Gideon came to stand beside her on the porch. "She will go to town," Mercy said. "She will say things." "Yes," he said. "I should leave tomorrow. The wheel will be fitted by now." "Probably," he said. A pause. "You do not have to," he said. She looked at him. "I am not asking you to stay out of charity," he said. "I am asking because the kitchen has been fed properly for 3 days for the first time since spring, and Calhoun has not paced his stall once, and I have slept without the dream that has been waking me since Jacob died." He stopped. "And because you are the first person I have sat on that step with since my wife died, and I was not aware until this week that I had missed it." The morning was very quiet around them. She thought about Settlers Bend and Mrs. Henley's boarding house and 40 miles of road. She thought about $2 and some cents. She thought about what it meant to stay, and what it cost and what it was worth. And she thought about a man who could not say his son's name until a stranger in his barn gave him a reason to. "I am not easy," she said. "I have strong opinions about ledgers and kitchens, and I do not change them when men disagree with me." "I have noticed," he said, "and I will not be talked about in town without recourse. If I stay, it needs to be on terms that are clear." He looked at her steadily. "What terms would those be?" he said. She met his eyes. "Honest ones," she said. He nodded once, the kind of nod that meant he understood what was being asked, and was prepared to give it. She went to town that afternoon with Foss driving the buckboard, and she went to the boarding house and took a room, which cost her more than she had planned, but which gave her an address and a respectability that Lavinia Crane could not easily talk around, and she registered herself as Mercy Aldis, widow, lately of Harlan Cross, employed as housekeeper at the Crane Ranch east of Settlers Bend. The woman at the desk wrote it down without comment. The town talked anyway. Towns always talk. But what they talked about was different from what Lavinia had intended to set in motion, because the story of a widow respectably employed was not the story Lavinia had tried to suggest, and the story of a woman who had gentled Gideon Crane's unmanageable horse was the kind of story that traveled faster than scandal in a place where everyone knew what that horse had meant. Lavinia came back once more, 3 weeks later, with a sharper version of the same smile and a comment about how fortunate it was that Gideon had found someone to manage his domestic arrangements. Gideon said nothing. Mercy said, pleasantly and directly, that it was fortunate indeed, and offered Lavinia more coffee. And Lavinia looked at her for a long moment and then accepted the coffee and did not come back after that. Calhoun let Gideon into his stall for the first time in 2 years on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 weeks after Mercy had arrived in his barn on a dark September night, with a trunk and a practical nature and $2 in her pocket. She was there when it happened. She had come to the barn for the morning and found Gideon standing outside the stall door, and she had stood at the barn entrance and watched him put his hand out, and watched Calhoun stretch his neck, and then step forward, slow and deliberate, and put his nose against Gideon's chest. Gideon stood very still. She watched his hand come up and rest on the horse's neck, and she watched something go out of him that had been held there for 2 years. She went back to the house and put the kettle on, and did not say anything about it when he came in 20 minutes later. She did not need to. He sat at the table and she put the coffee in front of him, and he looked at her across the table with those dark, steady eyes and said, "Thank you." She understood it was not only for the coffee. He asked her to marry him on the 1st of December, not with ceremony, not with speeches, but standing at the fence of the south pasture looking out at the land in the early morning with the frost still on the grass and the mountains blue in the distance. He said he understood if she needed time, and he understood if the answer was no, and he wanted her to know that his asking was not about the house or the cooking or the ranch, but about the step and the silence, and a woman who had put her hand against a grieving horse in the dark and given it back something it had lost. She said yes before he had finished the sentence. They were married in the Settlers' Bend church on a cold Saturday in January, with Foss and Pete as witnesses, and the minister who had known Gideon since before Jacob was born, and who shook Mercy's hand afterward and said he had not seen Gideon Crane look like that since his boy was alive, and Mercy thanked him and meant it. On the morning after the wedding, she went to the barn before breakfast the way she had every morning since September, and Calhoun was waiting at his stall door the way he always was, and she scratched between his ears, and he leaned into her hand, and she thought about a dark night and a broken wagon and a lantern in a barn door, and a man who had waited a long time for someone to give him a reason to say his son's name again. The frontier was still cold and wide and indifferent outside those barn walls. The wind still cut across the plains with nothing to stop it. But inside the barn it was warm, and it smelled of hay and horses and the particular piece of things finding their right place, and she was not going anywhere. She had asked to sleep in the barn one night, and by morning she had already begun to find her way home. If you have ever arrived somewhere broken and found it was exactly where you were meant to be, you will know how Mercy felt standing in that barn in January with her hand on that horse. Hit the like button if this story reached you, and subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had an animal sense something about you that the people around you missed?